Hello and welcome to another Imperfectly Perfect conversation for the Flourishing Education Podcast. Today I'm welcoming not one but two wonderful guests, Dr. Frances Howard and Dr. Karenza Moore. A very warm welcome to the podcast, both of you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So I was sort of explaining before we started recording, like the process. And so I'll start with the first question that I ask all of my guests to get us going, which is, who are you? Where are you in the world? And what has been your journey in education so far?
I can start with that. Thank you. My name is Frances Howard. I'm based in Nottingham. I currently work at Nottingham Trent University, but I haven't always been an academic. Before that, I was a youth worker, worked for 10 or 15 years in local authority and different youth charities. And so I think that kind of brought us really to this book. All of us share a kind of a practice or a work background with young people that helps to inform our research. So yeah, that's where I am right now. Thanks. Pass on to Karenza.
Thanks, Frances. My name's Dr. Karenza Moore. I'm a reader in sociology at Newcastle University. I've been working in the field of drug research in relation to young people's leisure activity, mostly in raves. That's where I kind of started, and clubs and now more festivals. And yeah, as Frances said, one of the reasons we came together for the book actually was that we were BSA, British Sociological Association, co-conveners of the Youth Studies group. And we were talking earlier about the pandemic and the impact on all of us in academia and obviously on our students and, other young people. And so we ended up hosting meetings for the BSA Youth Study Group during COVID, so I was obviously online, and it kind of, the community sort of emerged from there. So I think it's really kind of exciting to be talking today about a project that kind of emerged from COVID. I feel like it emerged from COVID, but it's now kind of got some more legs and it's, going places. So that's kind of exciting for us, I think.
Yeah, and it was so nice to meet you at BERA because BERA is where it all started really, because Karenza was representing BSA and I was representing the BERA Youth Studies and Informal Education groups. And what we realised, there were so many of us across different diverse fields that were doing research with young people, and we really wanted to kind of celebrate all those kind of innovative and emerging methods and think about something that could bring everybody together in this community, as Karenza said. So yeah, it's been great to be able to turn a kind of an online seminar series into a book.
Amazing. And for the listeners, so if you're on YouTube, you can see I'm showing the book, researching with young people. That's what we're going to be talking a lot about today. Just to help our listeners who may not be academics, a lot of the people who listen to the podcast are actually, mums or teachers, so they may not be totally like in higher education. Frances, could you tell us what BERA stands for?
Sorry, that's an acronym, isn't it? We do that a lot in universities. Well, the world does it a lot as well. And so the British Educational Research Association. So when I finished my role as a youth worker and went to do a PhD, I kind of did that in a Department of Education. So I studied alongside a lot of teachers, but always felt a little bit different as a youth worker, as an informal educator. I think what's happening now that teachers might appreciate, and also that's brought out in the book, is this infusion of informal methods and kind of relational methods with young people. We talk a lot about, there's a chapter on talking and listening and how important those listening skills are with young people, and how they're not always fully developed in research. When you go along with this list of questions that you've got approved by your ethics board and you're determined in your PhD journey to get the specific answers. So yeah, there's quite a lot of influence from my PhD journey as well, and the work through BERA.
I think that's one of the other things about youth studies, and Frances has obviously expertise in youth work, is that it often draws from lots of academic disciplines. So obviously I mentioned sociology. Frances has education background, education and research. And we also had Yanina, Sophie, and Ben. They've all got different backgrounds themselves. The Political Studies Association was also involved. So that's more the kind of young people's politics. So I think that's the other kind of exciting thing. It's about methods and doing research with young people, but it's also drawing from loads of different disciplines, which then obviously gives you lots of different tools and concepts to try and understand young people's lives.
And I think this is what interests me, because of course, this podcast for me is particularly relevant because I'm about to embark on my PhD fieldwork, which is participatory action research. So reading your book was so I was just finishing my ethics, and it's been, the chapter on ethics was just particularly useful because it's so easy in ethics to sort of think, oh, it's a tick box exercise and I'm just going to get consent from the university to do the work. But for me, it's always felt like ethics is what I live and breathe. It's like how we show up in everywhere, right? And so the chapter on ethics was really, really so useful to read. So perhaps we'll look at all of those different elements you mentioned in a minute. But I think I would like to start with one thing that struck me so I'm a recovering language teacher who's gone into doing a PhD and looking at why so many young people and adults are not flourishing in education and in our settings. And I was really struck by the title of your book. So, researching with young people. So can we linger with that? It's a really small word, right? With. And yet it makes such a difference. So could we just linger there a little bit in terms of the linguistics?
Yeah, of course. And I think when you get towards the end of the book, I think in the final chapter, we even start to italicize the word with, because that's really important. And we start with this premise that, young people have often been positioned as this object of study, studied from afar, misunderstood, deficit identities, all of that kind of stuff, negative stereotypes. And actually now the field is changing and shifting to make an effort to recognise that co-produced and participatory research done with young people, conducted with young people to varying degrees, is most meaningful for them, most impactful in terms of your research results. And for us, we developed this concept of an orientation. So this research is about our values base. It's something about the way we're oriented to conduct our research that wants to have the best, not only outcomes for young people in terms of social justice, but also the most meaningful experiences for them, so they can feel included and listened to, and all of those important aspects. Didn't know if you wanted to expand, Karenza.
Yeah, so I think it also matters quite a lot what the different fields are, for example, or maybe the different methods. So as Frances mentioned, you might have researching with young people in terms of them participating, developing, say, survey questions for a large scale longitudinal survey. So you can research with young people by including them in the kind of design of the research. So they're not just part your research subjects or your research participants. They're kind of actually co-creating the research with you. So I'll just give you an example. When I write surveys asking young people about their drug use, I always try and include young people in an advisory board, so that when I send them the survey and say, this is the kind of questions I'm going to ask about this particular thing, they'll often come back to me and say, well, that question doesn't make sense. And why are you asking that? So that's like one way of including them when we say I'm researching with young people. And you can do that at every different stage of the research, even, and we've included this in the book, kind of including them in producing the outputs from research, like journal articles, something quite traditional academic outputs, that's called co-authorship. Or you might want to produce a zine, for example, or a podcast. I mean, then we've got a case study about co-producing podcasts with young people. So And I know you've read the book, Fabian, so you've probably seen that one as well. And I feel like, you know, one of the exciting things now about youth research is we're looking much more at non-traditional outputs from research. And actually, as Frances says, that's often more impactful, perhaps, at least for the young people, than a journal article might be.
And I think that fits in with like looping back to ethics. It's at times frustrating how our systems, right, are perhaps not geared to be youth-centered and to be focused on you know, like the title of your book at the top is an introduction to youth-centered research methods. So, you know, going back to the ethics, which for you is at the end of your book, right? But if we start with that, the process of applying for ethics and what is required of us as academics in terms of paperwork, etc., doesn't fit in with what you share in your book to me. I mean, at times I find it really frustrating, like this whole idea of co-production. You know, who owns the research, right? Whose research is it? Those are questions that often we don't really address, or they're not really addressed, or it's not explicitly mentioned in your in the paperwork you've got to complete. But to me, at times, it felt a little bit jarring, and I had to sit with those frustrations, because also I need that tick and that ethical approval from my institution to be able to go and do the field work and to gain a PhD, right? So it's the frustration as well with that. So I don't know, is there any thoughts on those elements or anything you want to add?
I think in that ethics chapter, and it is written brilliantly by our co-author Sophie, we try and challenge the kind of risk management strategies of universities, because ethics is all about managing risk, not necessarily for the participants. That's why it's not youth-centred, it's for the university. It's a reputational risk for the university. And, you know, Sophie came up with this great phrase about, you know, you need to reflect all the time on an ongoing process about your ethics and what you're doing with young people. Because, you know, as you said, university ethics committees want a list of questions, what's going to come out at the end, who you're going to work with. And in a truly co-productive kind of a process, you don't know those things, and those things emerge. It's much more kind of naturalistic, but there's no space for that. So as you said, there's a real tension between, yes, PhD students need that sign off from ethics, but they also need to accommodate what the young people want. And I find, having done kind of doctoral supervision now of candidates, they're having to go back to the ethics committee 3 or 4 times during their research process because the ideas changed. And so it's very, very inflexible. And so we don't want to stop those kinds of research being done, because they're much more beneficial for young people. But what we need to do is make the structures a bit more flexible. So we try and challenge that in that chapter in particular.
I think I think there's a point at which you can engage, obviously not as a PhD student, but as time goes on, you can engage with institutional ethics. Like this is something I've tried to do, is to try to change a little bit of the way that they see young people when you're doing research. And the number of times that I've got it, actually with PhD students as well, gone up in front of institutional ethics boards. You always have to do a full review as soon as young people are mentioned. And as you can imagine, as soon as anything that is perceived from the outside, particularly as risky, is that you then have to kind of go and explain what you're going to do to manage the risk. As Frances said, a lot of it's about concern by the universities for their reputations. So I think one of the things I've found, and I know this comes up in the book, is that you can kind of meet the formal system with a formality of your own. So if you, for example, develop a protocol, and sometimes these protocols are actually quite long, of how you're going to manage each of the risks that the institutional ethics boards have come up, you know, they've mentioned. And by having a kind of response that you can sometimes do that in collaboration with some young people as well, if you've got an advisory board with young people on it. So even at that point, you can kind of say, this is how I'm going to manage these risks. Because if you just say, no, these risks aren't relevant to my research, that's not going to work. You have to kind of acknowledge and to a certain extent go along with how they frame young people. But it is really frustrating, and I think it's worse, that having to engage with ethics is more or less difficult depending on your project, and depending on your method as well. So in the book we've got a chapter about doing research in the places where young people are, what the places that they inhabit. And that's also one of our kind of five principles of research, which is great. But that also obviously means that, especially if you're doing ethnography, you're then in the physical spaces that young people are. And then that's sometimes perceived as an even riskier practice. So I suppose it's a case, as Frances says, of you do have to engage with that institutional ethics, but also once you're given the kind of all clear, that's just the beginning of the journey, really, as you say. And again, I think a lot of it's about speaking to your supervisor, being part of a PGR community where there'll be other PhD students there that are facing similar things. So hopefully, so Sophie's chapter, I think, it really shines a light on some of the ethical challenges. And Sophie did her PhD with transgender students in a school, and I know she really, had to navigate a lot of ethical challenges. So hopefully that her chapter, the book will really help other people.
It was so helpful because I am researching the lack of well-being and also with young people. So I know from past experiences, like the other research projects that I've had to apply, for ethics for. They're gonna look at my application with a comb, right? Because and rightly so, because of course, I don't want my research to have a negative impact on the young people who are, coming to collaborate with me. Absolutely not. So I completely get it. It's just that chapter was so helpful. All of them were really helpful, but that one, as I was in the process of finalizing my ethics, was just yes, this has been so helpful. So it's great. And then because I'm a linguist at heart, I'd like us to sort of linger on your intro in particular, and then we'll talk about the other, because I think it might be also useful, because this podcast will be useful for, postgrads like me who are interested in, doing research with, or, anybody who wants to do research with young people. But because I also know the listeners are mums and teachers, I think a lot of what you're writing in the book, you could replace the word research and say teach with young people, or use another, right? Be with young people. And that's equally as valid. So I think, I don't want people to just get hung up on the word research with, right? Because I think, to me, your book is so valuable for a parent or for a teacher in a classroom, as well as an academic. And I think I also wished I'd encountered your book as I was stepping away from being this teacher who believed in the system, and hence being, calling myself now a recovering teacher and a reformed mother. Because you use words that, in a way, there's a part of me that gets quite angry that I wasn't trained as a teacher to know those words and to understand how important they are. So words like adultism, words like Article 12 UNCRC, those are two examples that sort of come to mind. As a teacher, how on earth was I not taught that? I was taught to do how to do a plan for my lesson, a lesson plan, and the outcomes and the objectives. I had to start exploring through the podcast to sort of discover all of those words. So again, I've given you quite a bit. I wonder whether there's anything you want to add.
Well, I think we start the book on a kind of a premise that that young people are experts in their own lives, and that's what research and teaching and relationship does, is to reposition them at the centre. I think that's why we decided on the youth-centred methods as the kind of the subtitle. So it's about acknowledging them as experts in their own lives and not pushing adult agendas, and that's very difficult in research and teaching when you've got an expected outcome and you're measured on an expected outcome, whereas the outcome for the young person of the conversation with you or the creative methods activity, whatever you're doing, might be something different that you don't recognise or capture. So it's really just to kind of question those assumptions that as adults we have all the power, and you know, we should make all the decisions and decide everything ourselves. I think that was we really shared between all of the authors that positionality and that kind of, you know, that feeling in our hearts, that's that value base.
Yeah, I think I was just thinking as you're talking, Fabian, I think one of the things that we focus on quite a bit is power. So I think sometimes when, you know, it's interesting you say let's sort of not focus too much on the research. I know obviously Francis has got great expertise in youth work. You're a recovered teacher, which makes me smile. And all of that is about how do we interact with young people, whatever relationship or outcome we need to do. How do we interact them in a way that kind of acknowledges that they're often, their views and experiences are often silenced by adults, particularly if that young person happens to, be part of a more marginalised group that has kind of intersecting inequalities. So let's say, a young black man is not going to be listened to if they want to give an opinion about, let's say, drug policy. There's certain kind of power relations, in relation to age, but also, social class, race, ethnicity, sexuality, all that. And I think there's been a kind of, I know there's been a history of a decentering children and young people's voices because we assume that they somehow don't know what we know or we know better. And I think, that is a really problematic position. But I think my feeling is that's the position of the kind of, that's the dominant position really in society, isn't it? And to come along and say, actually, we really need to listen to young people, not just say that they're going to participate in our research and that's, the end of it, but really think about how they can participate in the research in a way it's truly kind of meaningful. And I think that's really, really important. So I'd say the two things you mentions there about adultism and Article 12, which basically says that a child has got a right to, give their view about what's something that's important to them or is going to shape their lives. Sadly, those views are often listened to but not acted upon, and that's the biggest difference I think with youth-centered anything really, is that we listen but we actually act on what young people are saying to us, and that's the kind of one of the most important things I think for us.
And I think what I'm hearing is what Francis has said a couple of times, which is like values-based. It's sort of like, do we I think I realize you were saying it's a positionality, or it's how you show up in the world. I realize that's definitely how I've always showed up in the world, even though I didn't realize. And in some environments, perhaps because they're more coercive than others, it's more challenging. So like as a recovering teacher, I realized that sometimes I did things because I was asked to do those things and I needed the job to pay the bills. So sometimes I just did those things even if I didn't really agree with them. And I think this is something that's quite important to acknowledge, particularly for teachers, or for parents, because, societally, our vision of children or how we view things. I've always felt really frustrated because I've got 2 teenage boys now, how like this adultism I've always felt, perhaps I felt it as a child as well, this sort of like whole idea that people will look at you when you're a child like you're this adult that's not quite an adult, and so what would you know, what would you have to say? and I think the gift is mine too. We've raised them in an environment where they definitely are not afraid of mirroring back. Mm-hmm. So they often say to me, "Mum, I'm hearing this and I'm seeing this. Which one is it?" Because to me, those can't be valid at the same time. I have to say, as an adult, sometimes I'm like, oh, I so wish I just could just say, oh, I'm the adult. No, we're not questioning this because it's very uncomfortable. But I feel I've grown so much because, and thanks to the 2 teenage boys in my life, right? So if some of the listeners are, in environments like I described, where or they find it challenging, those concepts of because in our, even in our institutions like our universities, right, there are things we have to do that may not work so well with that youth-centered. We've talked about the ethics, right, but the co-production and all of the other things. What advice would you have?
And can I jump in here, Francis? So I think that's a really difficult question, Fabian. But I think one of the things, I think I was sort of saying this in relation to ethics, that you sometimes just have to work with what you've got. And my advice there is to kind of push what we're doing, push what we're suggesting, but in little tiny ways, so you win small battles. And that's sometimes the only way that you can change things. It might be something really small. So to give you an example, I've worked a long time to try to persuade ethics boards that it's okay to speak to young people that are under 18 about drugs in my research. And that's actually kind of finally happened with all the checks and balances that are needed. But I feel like I could have kind of given up. It's the first time that was said, no, you can't do that. But I think sometimes depending on how the values that you have, you just have to kind of try and keep them, but just chip away at the things that you see that are wrong. And also obviously seek support, from other colleagues or people that you think might be not like-minded. And then the other thing I was going to suggest. You might be able to, and this is one of the case studies in the talking and listening chapter from academic called Elma, and she talks about gathering data with young people, statistical data, surveys, that kind of thing. Quite a lot of youth-centered research and, teaching that it does a lot of qualitative work. So it's about words and images and, the spoken word, that kind of thing. But we do still need robust data about young people's lives. Okay, so you would think from the outset that we go out and gather that data about young people. We kind of create them as statistical beings. One of the things you can do is to work with the young people to generate the questions that we're going to ask them. So you're still using a very very traditional tool of a survey. I mean, I have a real issue with some surveys are actually awful, and the way that they kind of create this almost demon of a young person. I think it's really important. So, but it is really important to have statistical data about young people's lives. So it's one way that you can engage with something that is really not what we would like to see, but making a small change so that we can kind of edge a little bit towards where we want to be with it, I think. But yeah, it's a really difficult thing because you have to work within the constraints. Everybody does, don't they? Including the young people. I think one of the other interesting things in the book I really liked from my co-authors was thinking about getting young people to participate in research and thinking about, well, what are the barriers that there might be for them? Even just something simple like, well, do they have the bus fare to get to the place where we're asking them to be interviewed? And so, just thinking about that, I would, suggest that's a kind of organisation issue. But actually, that goes to the heart of, are we enabling all the young people that we want to engage with to do so? And again, I think that's important as well.
And I like this sort of like tiny because I think for me that's where the wins are. That's like it just little steps, the things that you can do that's still within the construct of where you are, but that just makes you feel, that gives you, to go back to Jane Goodall, like hope. They sort of like never give up and have this hope. I think that's quite that to me feels a really, we can all do little things, right? And that fits in with that talking and listening chapter, which also was so, for me, I absolutely loved. So when I read it, I was reminded of my grandmother, who as a teenager, I was a difficult teenager. And so my grandma used to say, Fabienne, one of these, two of those, please use them in their sort of respective, like, match how many you have. And that was really helpful, because particularly now as an adult, it's so easy to, and it fits in with the power thing. It's like how often we don't realize that we have the power, even if we, there's this, like, for example, when I facilitate seminars as a postgrad teacher, in with first year students, they still see you as someone who has more knowledge than them, and because the system has taught them not to be to ask questions, right? Like, great, but not this question because there's too much in the curriculum. They feel a bit like, I can't really ask those questions because they're going to think I'm stupid and all of those things. And so your chapter, I bring with me every time, like in my heart, in the classroom, because it's so, it was so useful. So could we linger there, and would you share with the listeners who've not read the book what you talk about the talking and listening bit?
Okay, so I think one of the main things was thinking of talking and listening as a skill. And Francis has mentioned this in the intro. So that just means, I love what your grandma says, actually. That so we can build our skills by using our ears. We've got two of them rather than one mouth. I like talking. I also like listening. I love music. So, I've trained my ears to listen in a certain way. If you DJ, you have to listen to two things, different things in each ear. So then you have to learn to combine them and kind of see a link between the two. So that's my kind of idea of building a skill of listening. So that's important. The other thing that comes out in the chapter, I think we've sort of talked about this a little bit already, but positioning young people that we research with or teach with or have relationships with them to acknowledge that they're often not listened to, and to kind of check in with ourselves whether or not we are listening, particularly if they're saying things that we might find uncomfortable and difficult. And then to kind of explore with the young people what that means for them. So again, it's that, excuse me, it's that giving young people the authority to speak, listening to them, and also kind of situating them or understanding how they're situated within their lives that might mean that that's the things that they're saying. So yeah, that's a difficult one, but I just feel like we often have conversations with young people, but if we stop and pause and think, what are they saying, and how does it link to, for example, their things that they've experienced in the past, not just thinking what they're saying, what does it mean for the future. We might want to think a little bit more also about, well, how does what they're saying link to their experiences in the past. For example, we've got a section at the end of the book called Hauntings or Hauntology. It's a certain approach within youth studies. And really for me, it says we need to also listen to what young people are saying about how their past experiences are influencing where they are now and where they might want to go in the future. So you would have thought that's quite obvious, but we don't often really listen to young people when they say what's happened to them in the past. I mean, it's so interesting because I think we orientate young people towards the future so much. We want to know what's their career trajectory. you know, and sometimes we might want to ask, well, what was it like at school for you, and how do those experiences you had then shape your classroom behaviour or whatever it is.
And that, to me, feeds in another question I get really frustrated with when I go back home to France, and a lot of our family sort of members and friends say to our two boys, what do you want to do when you grow up? Mm-hmm. And I always say, I don't know what I want to do when I grow up, so I doubt they know what they want to do. So it's such an interesting question, right? Like that trajectory, like linear. And as you were talking, Karenza, I was sort of reminded, like, the image is this, rear view mirror sometimes is really useful, like looking like the journey we've been on and what all of us bring in the room, or what has been our experiences, and how, like you said, that might shape what happens next, what step we take. And how easy, and I think in a way that sort of touches in that chapter around the ethnography that you wrote, Frances, around, how our stories, our journey sort of then shape who we are and the stories we tell and we share, and how also, like for me, because my brain works with images, it reminds me of like that picture of the elephant and the 7 blind men, like how it's so easy to think that everybody's talking about the thing in the same way, when depending on how we're looking, where we're looking, and what we bring with us, that will be a completely different outcome. And we all think we're talking about that one element, but actually it's completely different when you spend time really listening to what people are saying and checking in. I've heard this, is that right? Like, is that what you I think that's what I like about my two boys, is that I don't even need to say, is that right? Because they just go, no, you've not heard what I've said. And so I would love if we could create an environment for all young people to go, no, you've not heard me. So I don't know, Frances, is there anything you would want to share or add to what we've discussed so far?
I think that would be good to talk about. I think maybe the people who are interested, this could be teachers or parents or researchers, in the kind of digital world. I think that's something that comes through, or we intentionally brought through the book, because during COVID so many people were experimenting with different ways of communicating, conducting research. There's kind of growing fear and kind of scapegoating of digital worlds in terms of safeguarding and risk to young people, and even more kind of risk through ethics committees of getting digital methods and things like that signed off. So we were really determined that there would be a digital aspect within the book. But actually what we found is that the principle of undertaking research with young people wasn't just about the digital realm, because the case study that we had to do with that showed that young people inhabit both real world and digital world. They're kind of symbiotic, if you like. So and you can't divide them. So we had some examples of that, which was really interesting, and I think that'd be really useful for encouraging people to do more innovative research and use different platforms to reach young people. I'm trying to think what else was in the book that we were quite keen on, and that's where the places and spaces come in. Young people have online communities as much as real world communities, and they're important to them, and how do we get access to communities? Do we get invited to different spaces? Are we imposters? Are we lurkers? Are we, especially with ethnography, just hanging around the adult in the corner? What does our presence mean to be there? Can we truly be accepted? Can we truly see through the eyes of young people? So these are all things that we kind of grappled with. And there was a great quote that somebody came up during the seminar series about ethnography, actually, and to say, about researching. It was saying we're all doing research of the time that we're in, because we were saying, how COVID changed things. And, we're all just grappling with the changing social conditions, the time we're in, and how we work with young people. whether that's teaching, research, or parenting. We're always responding to that because it's always changing.
And I think it brings a lot of fear, right, particularly for us adults, like you were saying, because of the fear mongering and this fitting back with the adultism. So this whole idea that, I'm thinking, Karenza, with like drugs, like sort of suggesting that if you talk to young people about drugs, you might plant ideas in their heads, right? It's the same with like, I've got a lot of the young people that I've been co-creating with are neurodivergent, and they're also either non-binary or trans, and I guess teenagers. And this idea that suddenly, if you're going to talk to a child about being gay or lesbian or not being heterosexual and falling into the norm, somehow you're going to plant ideas in their minds, right? And that a lot of us adults are really scared. I mean, I love teenagers. I find them really, really amazing. And I think that when we spend enough time with them, they have so much wisdom that we can glean from what they share. Of course, they need elders also. I think, like, it's not about turning teenagers or young people into amazing heroes that are going to sort out a lot of the work. In fact, a lot of the young people that I've been sort of speaking to have been pushing back, saying you can't ask us to solve the mess that has been created, right? So it's not about idolizing them, but I guess it's sort of like perhaps changing how we think and what we do and how we are with young people.
I think Frances mentioned a phrase that experts of their own experiences, which is something that we've tried to incorporate in the book. And I think there's so many, drugs and gender identity issues, two of the things that I look at. And I think there's just, going back to adultism, we adults just, assume that we know better than young people about how they feel, what they want to do, what futures they have had, that they're looking forward to. I feel that we often impose our own concerns onto young people. I don't think we give them enough credit for a level of an understanding that they have of various different issues. And it goes back to power. I mean, adultism is basically the power that adults have over children and young people. And there's an assumption also there that that power is not beneficial to young people. And that so in some ways challenging adultism would mean that we would have more young people's voices and we'd actually listen to them, and we wouldn't put our own kind of value systems onto them, for example. So and I think it's also interesting what you said about young people, that it's not their responsibility to sort out us as adults. It's not their responsibility to sort out our mess. So when we're asking them, how are you going to create this amazing future? It's like, well, so I just think it's I get very frustrated as well, Fabian, that there's I think the political position is often that young people don't know what they're talking about and we know better, which put simply is nonsense as far as I'm concerned. And hopefully we brought out that in the book. So it's all very well to say that, but I think it's also important to actually have some tangible things you can do, methods you can use, positions you can take to actually operationalize that, to make that into act, rather than just saying, we need to listen to young people. We'll do a consultation, but whatever, it's not sufficient, I don't think, for how much we need to change the way that we approach the way that we engage with young people.
And I think this is what I loved about your book, is that it's very practical. So going back to my question, if you are in a coercive environment, or like you work in a school or whatever, and you're a parent and you're a little bit confused and worried about their world of like gaming online and all of those things, you give such really tangible tools that's really helpful. And I think it sort of then fits in also with like some of the chapters we're not talked about, but the co-production and co-authoring, and then the creative methods, because all of those are so not the typical inverted commas ways of producing research, right? Because I guess, again, like, there's an unspoken, but the reality in education, or in in higher education, is that when you publish an article and you literally publish, there's names on an article, right? And that's also linked to your progression as an academic and your professional life. So I don't know, like, is there anything you would want to share, like, about that, like the challenges? Again, it's almost like we're having to hold different it's almost paradoxes. I don't know if they're paradoxes, but like challenges that we need to hold, and how do we then co-create or co-produce or use creative methods that perhaps the young people would want to engage with much more.
I think it's always important to remember who you're doing the research for. There's a really great case study in the co-authorship chapter, actually, which grapples with the kind of the challenges of co-authoring a journal article, and also we suggest other kind of outputs that can be co-authored with young people. And I think it's that game playing, isn't it, in academia, the slow work and things that you can perhaps disseminate more quickly and to the audiences that matter, the audiences that have been actually your participants. So we suggest a range of things because we believe a range of things should happen. It's not just about talking in an echo chamber and adding to your publications list, because actually does the things on those lists actually go and change the world? Or is it the work that you've done with the young people and those kind of more grassroots things that are disseminated? Yeah.
I don't know if there's a question I've not asked you that you're sitting here thinking, I so wish Fabian had asked me this question.
Can we just dwell a bit on creative methods? Because I do think that's a really important chapter, going back to what you were saying about kind of practical issues. So, I mean, this is that's not my area, this is France's area, but I think creative methods are really, really important, but that we shouldn't assume that all young people are comfortable with being creative. And one of the things that I know that chapter talks about is this idea of kind of being relaxed about the creative output itself. So that might be that the output itself is something that we analyze, but that just being relaxed about it and letting young people kind of take their creativity or where they want to go with it. So yeah, I think the creative, I guess if you would say, is there one method, not necessarily a research position, but a method that's really exciting and that's really kind of opening up a lot of opportunities, I think, for researching with young people, it is probably one creative methods. And I'm not going to say the whole range because there's such a broad range of things, but just that there's something in there for everyone, I think, and for young people that are into all different types of interest. So there might be creating a podcast, we said that, might be creating a poem, spoken word. I know a lot of young people are into kind of rap lyrics, rhyme lyrics, all that kind of stuff. So music is often a big part of young people's lives. So I know there's some really interesting work around music making, creativity as well. So that feels to me like something that we should bring to the fore in the podcast. And I mean, a lot of young people now, they use technical technology to create some really fantastic things. I mean, a project I worked on, young people created drug harm reduction a leaflet basically with me, and they chose the images. It looks so much cooler than the one I made. And I think it really spoke to a lot of young people because it was made by young people. And when we told them that was what happened, the young people that were looking at the harm reduction leaflet were like, oh, that's so cool, that other young people have made this and it's not just you. So yeah, so Frances, you are the creative methods expert here. So, but yeah, just to flag creative method.
I think you've explained that really well, Karenza. And I think one chapter that really inspired me was actually Karenza's chapter on placemaking, because I love to be kind of reminded about the different places that young people inhabit and how we gain access to them, and how that can be quite problematic sometimes. And also to think about the places that young people create, not only digitally but in the real world. And there's a really great case study in that chapter around muddy methods. So, festival research. I know Karenza's specialism is club research, but if you're at a festival, how practically are you going to collect a survey if it's raining, or speak to young people if they're intoxicated? All of those kind of like thorny issues. I think the authors of that case study did really well in kind of grappling with that. So yeah, we acknowledge that research doesn't just happen in labs, schools, expected places where young people are. It's these places that they're making themselves that we need to inhabit with them, really.
And I think this is what I love about your book, is that you beautifully show the, like we've meandered in terms of like the different chapters, right? So ethics is at the end, but I've actually brought it at the beginning. And there's this sort of this dancing and flow forming with what is, and, with us as the researcher or the parent or the teacher, but also like the people who are in the room and the room itself and the place and everything else, right? And it's so easy to believe, because that's what our education and schooling system makes us believe, that it's going to be really neat and tidy, and that there's going to be little boxes and you can make it all fit in, right? So going back to ethics, I've sent them a list of questions, but what happens if we meander in different questions, right? That are not on the list? Are you not allowed to ask those questions? What happens, right? So it's almost like the messiness, the muddy festival place, right? Perhaps life is just like that. I don't know.
Yeah, 100% agree with that kind of messiness and complexity. There's no, we wouldn't want to neatly categorize young people in boxes. Lives are different, they change very quickly, society changes very quickly, it is messy and complex and kind of interrelated. But if you take with you, as we suggest in the last chapter, these set of 5 principles into your work, then whatever you encounter, whatever group of young people, whatever setting, whatever complication or challenge, taking forward these kind of 5 principles, you can navigate them, we hope, with their kind of like your toolbox that you take away from the book beyond the kind of thematic chapters, these 5 ways of working with young people.
Amazing. And perhaps it might be useful. Would you want to tell us what those 5 as a recap as we've meandered together?
Yeah, so I mean, what we did in the conclusion chapter, the final chapter, instead of just kind of recapping on each of the thematic chapters, we looked really hard at what kind of threaded them together and the common themes were. And we actually realised that there were 5 strong principles emerging that would help researchers, parents, teachers do work with young people. And the first one was around this kind of orientation, realising that you do the research because you're oriented in the way to conduct research with young people. So that was really important, to that conceptual understanding, that positionality. The second principle is around spaces. So really thinking about the spaces that young people inhabit and how to gain access to them, have been already mentioned. The third principle is around co-creation, so privileging the co-creation of knowledge with young people, and there's some tools to do that in the book. Ben and Yanina designed this wonderful kind of like swingometer diagram where you can have thick and thin participation. It's fantastic. And with that kind of co-creation comes the 4th principle, which is around dissemination, which we've talked about, thinking about different ways of reaching audiences, and kind of that includes co-authoring, but championing actually this is a way of pushing back on that kind of dominant westernized knowledge production. And then the 5th one was around power, and power and ethics seem to thread through each of these. So, having this real kind of strong ethical base of justifying why you would centre young people and why you would recognise them as experts redresses that kind of power imbalance. So we felt with those 5 ingredients, no matter whatever your method or your setting or your challenge or the young people you're working with, you could draw upon those as your kind of backbone to doing your research with young people.
Like a compass, right? Like guiding everything you do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. So is there anything else you want to add before I ask you my last question? Is there anything that you feel I've missed whilst we meandered and sort of like danced together for an hour?
And the only thing I was going to mention, Fabian, is that, as Francis said at the end of the book, we do look, just talking about not looking to the future, but we do look to the future of youth-centered research, and just look at some of the different challenges. So we talk a little bit about AI. I also mentioned about a kind of approach called hauntology, which kind of asks you to think more about young people's past experience as well as futures. So even as the books come out, and it's kind of lots of up-to-date knowledge and lots of up-to-date case studies, but then time moves forward and things change, especially because young people are often at the vanguard of engaging with new technologies and that kind of thing. So we already then start to look at where might we be going. So there's a little bit of reflection at the end on that, and I'm sure your listeners will probably have their own thoughts about where we're going as well, if you centre young people in whatever relationship you engage them with. So
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time, both of you. I could talk to you for hours, but I'm conscious that our time and energy is our most precious resources, so look after them properly. So just to wrap up, is there anything that we've meandered or sort of talked about and you thought, oh, okay, that's quite interesting, I've not thought about, and you're taking away with you, or that and you want to leave us with?
I think your kind of contention at the beginning about research could be substituted with anything, like teaching or youth working or relationships. Actually the principles could extend beyond research to any kind of work or relationships you have with young people, because it's a kind of an orientation, a values base. I think the relevance to education I see quite strongly, but also lots of other fields and ways of working with young people. So yeah, I'll take that away from today, definitely.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, just let's think about young people's involvement in, say, policy making. That might be in a very different space to the kind of academic research we're used to. So it's nice to think that there might be a bigger audience for our work. That's really exciting.
Yeah, amazing. Well, I want to thank you both, because your book has been so timely for me, and I literally carry around and dip in. I just open a page and read, and I'm definitely going to take it with me on my field work with young people. So, and with the two teenage boys I have the privilege of calling my son. So I really want to thank you for your work. As academics, we don't often hear or know what impact our work has on the
on the readers.
Yeah, on the readers, or so that'll be my little gift back to you for writing this beautiful book.
It's a good thing it's not too heavy, Fabian. That would not be good.
Yeah, wonderful. So thank you so much. Maybe if our listeners wanted to reach out to you, where can they find you? Are you, first of all, happy for people to contact you? And if so, how do they do that? Maybe we can finish with that.
Yeah, in the front of the book, we've got our names and institutions, so we're all very easy to find. You just stick your name in and what university we're at, and then we'll pop up.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, and I hope your book finds its way to many, many people.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.